You ever have one of those mornings where you swear the universe is punking you? Yeah, this was one of those. The sun wasn't even up yet, the world still half asleep, and there she was, my neighbor, standing in my driveway like she owned the place, yanking on my EV charger like it owed her money. At first I thought maybe I was dreaming, maybe my brain was playing tricks after too many late nights. But then I heard the snap of the cable, the hiss of frustration, and that sharp muttered curse that could peel paint off a wall. That's when I realized this wasn't a prank. This was the start of something much, much bigger. From that moment on, nothing in our little perfect neighborhood was ever the same. You see, where I live, people don't fight with fists or words. They fight with citations, fines, and anonymous complaints slipped into mailboxes at midnight. Every smile hides a grudge. Every wave has an agenda. And when someone like Denise Carmichael, our self-appointed queen of order, decides you're the problem, the game stops being fair real fast. She wasn't just another nosy neighbor. She was the kind of woman who believed control was a moral duty. Every flower bed, every porch light, every trash bin placement was her domain. And my single electric charger? To her, it was a crime against tradition, a spark threatening her entire kingdom of manicured perfection. At first I thought I could ignore her, laugh it off. But what started as weird looks and muttered complaints turned into something darker, late-night tampering, false reports, and accusations that made no sense to anyone but her. She called it defending the neighborhood's harmony. I called it obsession, but the wildest part? I didn't even realize how deep her madness went, how far she was willing to go, until the night her $1 million SUV went up in flames and she stood in the firelight screaming that my charger had attacked her. Looking back, I should have seen the signs sooner, the glances, the threats, the whispers about electrical toxins and neighborhood corruption. But tell me, what do you do when a war starts in your own driveway and the person waging it truly believes they're the hero? Would you fight back or just watch everything burn? You know, when I first moved into Willow Heights, I thought I'd finally made it. Not rich, not famous, but stable. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked like it belonged on a real estate brochure, manicured lawns that seemed to breathe in sync, matching mailboxes lined up like soldiers, and neighbors who smiled with that polite suburban tightness that said, "We don't know you yet, but we're watching." It was peaceful, predictable, and, at least at first, everything I wanted after years of apartment chaos and city noise. My house sat near the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, modern but modest. I'd saved for years to buy it. 3 bedrooms, a small garden, and a wide driveway that I took pride in keeping spotless. The garage was my little kingdom, organized tools, spotless floor, the faint smell of engine oil mixed with fresh paint. And right by the sidewall, my pride and joy, a brand new Level 2 EV charger, wired perfectly, humming with quiet efficiency. To me, it wasn't just a charger, it was a symbol of progress, my little contribution to the future. Willow Heights, though, was a place that worshipped the past. Most of the homes were older, brick fronts, classic shutters, pastel trims, and the people matched their houses. They liked things the way they'd always been. Every driveway had a gas-guzzling monument to tradition, sedans, SUVs, a few pickup trucks. The idea of someone driving an electric vehicle here wasn't just unusual, it was practically scandalous. That should have been my first clue. At first, everything felt normal enough. I'd exchange the usual morning nods, wave at joggers, and chat with the mailman about how quiet the neighborhood was. On weekends, folks would gather at the community park for yard sales or family barbecues. There was an unspoken rhythm here, a kind of clockwork harmony that everyone seemed desperate to maintain. But harmony, I would learn, was just another word for control, and control had a name. Her name was Denise Carmichael, though everyone called her Madame D. She wasn't officially on the HOA board anymore, but that didn't stop her from acting like she still ran the place. Picture a woman in her late 50s, dressed like every day was an interview for Queen of the Suburbs. She wore pearls to rake leaves and heels to fetch her mail. Her voice was sugar-coated authority, soft when she wanted to sound charming, sharp when she didn't. The HOA technically had 5 members, but Denise was the orbit everything revolved around. There was Tom, the president, who mostly just nodded when Denise talked. His wife, Carol, was in charge of beautification, which basically meant she wandered around counting how many inches your grass grew between mowings. Then there was Marty, the treasurer, a retired accountant who loved rules more than people. And finally, Grace, who was supposed to handle disputes but mostly just forwarded Denise's emails. They ran the HOA like a country club with barbed wire, fines for bins left out too long, warnings for unauthorized holiday lighting, even letters about unapproved paint undertones. But people went along with it because, well, that's what you did. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted to be that neighbor. I wasn't planning on being that neighbor either. For the first few months, life was simple. I worked from home, kept to myself, and quietly enjoyed the peace that came with predictable days. Every morning I'd step outside, coffee in hand, and admire how sunlight hit the polished panels of my EV. Birds, breeze, quiet. I remember thinking, this is what home is supposed to feel like. Then, one morning, I found a folded notice tucked into my mailbox. No stamp, no signature, just printed in that passive-aggressive HOA tone. Dear resident, a neighbor has expressed concern regarding visible electrical equipment installed without prior authorization. Please contact the HOA within 48 hours to avoid penalties. I remember staring at it, confused. My charger? The one completely inside my property line? Installed by a licensed electrician? Surely this was a mistake. I called the number listed, and of course got Carol. Oh, that must have been Denise, she said lightly, like it was the weather. She mentioned something about your setup disrupting the visual flow of the street, I asked. Visual flow? She hesitated. You know, the, neighborhood aesthetic. That phrase, neighborhood aesthetic, was my first real warning. It was the first time I realized how deeply Denise's influence ran here. Later that afternoon, Denise herself appeared, clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses reflecting the glare of my driveway like a mirror of judgment. I assume you received the notice, she said. Not a question, a statement. I explained calmly that everything was up to code, inspected, permitted, but she wasn't listening. She was studying the charger like it was a ticking bomb. It's unsightly, she finally said, and it doesn't fit the energy harmony of our street. I almost laughed. Energy harmony? She smiled tightly. These new machines give off emissions of a different sort. You might not see them, but they affect balance. You'll understand in time. She left after that, but not before taking a few photos of my garage wall. That night, my security camera caught her walking past my driveway 3 separate times. Each time, she paused by the charger. Once, she even knelt down, as if inspecting it. The next morning, another notice, this time citing unapproved modification of curb-facing property. Never mind that my charger wasn't curb-facing. It was on a side wall, barely visible unless you went looking. And that's when it began. Every day after that, something new. A letter, a complaint, a courtesy reminder. At first it was all paper, bureaucratic smoke. But then came the looks. Neighbors who used to wave now turned their heads. Kids who used to ride their bikes near my driveway suddenly crossed the street instead. It was subtle, like the neighborhood itself had shifted just a few degrees colder. I started noticing how tightly wound everyone seemed. The HOA meetings were less discussions and more performances. Denise standing at the front, speaking like a preacher, while everyone else murmured agreement. She talked about preserving identity, about guarding tradition from invasive trends. Amma, she never said my name. She didn't have to. It wasn't long before the passive aggression turned active. One morning, my garden hose was sliced clean through. Another day, I found a sticky note on my mailbox. Some of us don't want radiation next door. I tried reasoning with her once more, on a Sunday. I caught her pruning her roses, snipping with surgical precision. "Denise," I said carefully, "I don't want conflict. I just want to live peacefully." She didn't even look up. Peace requires discipline. Discipline requires compliance. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about power. Still, part of me tried to believe it would blow over. I'd seen people in neighborhoods like this overreact before. But Denise wasn't like most people. Her obsession wasn't fading. It was sharpening. Over the next few weeks, she began escalating her campaign. She called city inspectors. She accused me of violating energy codes. Each time they cleared me, and each time she grew angrier. She started muttering to anyone who'd listen about electrical contamination and vibrational corruption. Soon, I wasn't just the neighbor with the weird car. I was the outsider, the disruptor, the enemy. Even the HOA board began to splinter under her paranoia. Tom tried to calm her once, suggesting maybe she was overreacting. The next week, he received a formal ethics review filed by Denise for lack of leadership integrity. Carol stopped attending meetings altogether. Grace started whispering to me during walks, quiet, nervous words about how Denise didn't used to be like this. The neighborhood began to fracture. Lines were drawn. Some avoided me entirely, others quietly offered sympathy, but never in public. You could feel the tension hum in the air like static, something charged and waiting to break. And through it all, I just kept charging my car, hoping the noise would drown out the whispers, but deep down, I knew something was coming. You can't reason with someone who believes they're fighting a holy war. And to Denise, that's exactly what this was, an ideological battle between purity and progress. Sometimes at night, I'd catch her silhouette through her window, standing motionless, staring toward my driveway, like she could hear the faint hum of the charger even through walls and distance. The first spark of the coming chaos wasn't the explosion. It wasn't even the shouting matches. It was the night she taped a handwritten sign to my fence that read, "Electricity is chaos disguised as progress." When I pulled it down, I noticed something else, tiny burn marks on the grass near the charger, like someone had been experimenting. That's when I stopped thinking this was a neighborhood squabble and started realizing I was living inside someone else's unraveling. I just didn't know how bad it was going to get. Not yet, folded neatly, tucked behind the brass handle of my mailbox like a snake lying in wait. The HOA letterhead gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Crisp, official, cold. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. Inside, the words were clipped, almost smug. Notice of violation. Unauthorized exterior modification. Immediate removal required to comply with HOA guidelines. Failure to do so may result in daily fines. The modification they were referring to? My electric vehicle charger. The same one I'd gotten approved months ago. The same one Denise herself had waved off during the board's last casual check-in with that polite, tight smile she wore like armor. I reread the letter 3 times. It didn't make sense. There was no signature from the architectural committee, just Denise's. She wasn't even authorized to issue solo violations. That was red flag number 1. I should have ignored it. Should have laughed it off, or called a lawyer right then and there. But I didn't. I thought, naively, that maybe if I just talked to her, reasoned a little, this would all go away. So, the next morning, I knocked on her door. Her garden was immaculate as ever. Roses trimmed to precision, grass a perfect emerald carpet. She opened the door halfway, her pearl earrings catching the light. "Morning, Denise," I said, holding up the letter. "Got this yesterday." "I think there's been some mistake." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, no mistake," she said sweetly. "We've had multiple complaints about your charger. It's not the approved model." "The model?" I repeated. "It's the same one on your list." She shrugged. "Well, maybe once. But we're updating our guidelines. It's about consistency." And with that, she closed the door. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Within a week, a fine appeared, $50, then another, each one stacked like bricks on my sanity. I emailed the HOA board. No response. I went to the next meeting. Postponed. Denise had the board wrapped around her finger, or maybe they were afraid of her. Because soon, it wasn't just about the charger. One morning, I walked out to find my trash cans slightly tipped, their contents spilled. A reminder notice hung on my front door. Bins must be stored out of street view within 1 hour of pickup. Violation noted. Then came the notice about my lawn being 1.5 inches over length regulation. Next, a complaint about the unsightly reflection from my car windshield supposedly disturbing neighbors' peace. It was absurd, almost laughable, but there was nothing funny about watching my bank account drain in real time. I tried appealing, but Denise controlled the records. My emails vanished. My calls went unanswered. The neighbors started whispering. It began innocently, the kind of small talk that used to fill our cul-de-sac with warmth. "Hey, heard about the charger thing. Hope it gets sorted," but soon the tone shifted. Conversation stopped when I walked by. I'd catch curtains moving in the corners of my eyes. Then came the day I saw Denise standing with her clipboard, pointing at my house while chatting with 2 board members and Mrs. Graham, the gossip queen of the block. They looked like vultures circling a wounded animal. That's when I started documenting everything, every letter, every photo, every timestamp. I started keeping a journal, not because I planned to fight yet, but because something deep down told me this wasn't over. Still, even I wasn't prepared for what came next. It started raining that weekend. One of those relentless downpours that makes the whole world smell like mud and asphalt. At 2 a.m., I woke to a low hum outside. I looked out the window. A tow truck idled in my driveway, red and yellow lights cutting through the dark. My new car, was being hooked up to the winch. I threw on a jacket and ran outside, yelling over the rain. "What the hell are you doing?" The driver barely looked at me. "HOA request. Non-compliant vehicle." I stood there drenched, hands shaking. "What? Non-compliant? Are you kidding me?" He handed me a slip. Denise's signature again. Vehicle not approved for overnight driveway parking. I couldn't even process it. I'd paid for covered parking access. My driveway was part of my own property. But the HOA's community covenant gave them leeway to enforce uniform aesthetics. Uniform aesthetics. I wanted to scream. The next morning, I found an email from Denise. "Please refrain from aggressive confrontation with community contractors. Your behavior has been reported to the board." That was the breaking point, because that line, "reported to the board," wasn't a warning. It was a threat. I started seeing what they were doing, isolating me, turning small inconveniences into a campaign of pressure, a psychological chess match. But I wasn't going to roll over. I filed a formal grievance. I demanded the board's meeting minutes, the audit reports, the financial records, documents they were legally obligated to share with homeowners. Days later, I got a reply. "Your request is denied. Records are confidential to board members only. Except that's illegal, and I knew it, so I called the county housing department. Quietly, carefully, I told them what was happening, the missing signatures, the fines, the blocked access to documents. They told me something that chilled me to the bone. You're not the first complaint from Willow Heights." Suddenly things clicked. This wasn't just me. Denise had done this before. She was running the HOA like a personal kingdom, using the bylaws as weapons, and I was her latest target, so I went deeper. Through late nights and bleary eyes, I started digging. I found discrepancies, thousands of dollars allocated for landscaping that didn't exist, invoices signed by Denise herself, payments routed to a company she owned under another name. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. But before I could expose it, she struck again. One Thursday afternoon, I came home from work to find a notice nailed to my door, literally nailed. "Final warning. Your property is subject to lien for unpaid HOA fees and fines. Immediate payment required to avoid legal action." My hands trembled as I read it. A lien. They were trying to take my home. I called, emailed, even went to her house. No response. That night, I sat in my car, staring at the quiet, manicured lawns of Willow Heights. Every house looked the same. Every porch light glowed like a watchful eye. I felt trapped. That's when I noticed the motion sensor light flicker on by my garage, a figure darting past. I froze, then crept toward the door, my phone camera ready. A woman, Mrs. Gramp, stood there, snapping photos of my backyard fence. "What are you doing?" I demanded. She jumped, stammering. "Did Denise ask for updates on noncompliance reports?" "Noncompliance of what?" She didn't answer, just scurried away into the dark. That was it. I realized I wasn't fighting one person anymore. It was a system, a hive, but what they didn't know was that I'd already set my own trap. The next HOA meeting was the first one open to homeowners in months. I showed up early, sat near the front, and waited. Denise walked in with her signature poise. Pearls, pastel blazer, clipboard clutched like a weapon. The room buzzed with quiet conversation. When she called the meeting to order, I stood up calmly. "Before we begin," I said, "I'd like to address the unauthorized fines and misuse of HOA funds." The room fell silent. Denise's smile didn't flinch. "You're out of order." "Sit down. I have documentation," I continued, voice steady. "Emails, receipts, and county records showing over $20,000 misallocated under your authorization." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Denise's pen clattered to the table. "You're making baseless accusations." "Baseless?" I held up printed statements. "Landscaping invoices for properties that don't exist. Payments to a company registered to your husband's name." "You want me to keep going?" For a moment, the mask cracked. Her eyes darted toward the board members, two of whom suddenly wouldn't meet her gaze. I'd hit a nerve. That meeting didn't end quietly. She tried to adjourn, but neighbors began to shout questions. People I hadn't spoken to in months were suddenly demanding answers. It was chaos. Shouting, papers flying, Denise storming out while the rest of the board scrambled. And me. I just sat there, heart pounding, knowing the tide had turned. But I also knew people like Denise don't go down without a fight, and she didn't. The next day I got a notice from her attorney claiming defamation, but it was too late. The county investigator had already opened an inquiry, and soon subpoenas were flying. What followed was a storm of rumors, news vans, and late-night phone calls. Neighbors started sharing their own stories. Years of intimidation, false fines, manipulated votes. I wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in months. Neither was the truth. But just when I thought things couldn't escalate any further, they did. One night, around 11 p.m., I heard glass shatter. I ran to the living room. The window facing the street was cracked. A rock lay on the floor. Taped to it was a note. "Stop or you'll regret it." I felt every ounce of air leave my lungs. This was no longer about money or rules or power. It was personal. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with every light on, listening for every creak and shadow, and in that sleepless silence, I realized something. Denise had crossed a line she could never uncross. Because once fear turns into fury, there's no going back. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, that heavy electric kind of quiet where even the air feels like it's holding its breath. I remember that morning perfectly. How the light filtered through the blinds in stripes, cutting across the floor like bars. I stood there in my living room, staring at the subpoena papers spread out across the table. Every word burning itself into my mind. Denise had gone too far this time. The rock through my window had been the final straw. The police had taken a report, sure, but they called it vandalism, like it was just some bored kid. I knew better. Denise wanted me to back off, to disappear quietly like the others she'd crushed before. But I wasn't going anywhere. That morning the county hearing was set, the big one, the one that would decide whether Willow Heights HOA faced a full audit or if Denise and her board could sweep everything under the rug one last time. I'd prepared for weeks. My binder was full, stick documents, emails, photos, signatures. But even so, I couldn't shake the fear crawling under my skin. Because Denise wasn't stupid, she was a strategist, and she played dirty. When I pulled up to the community hall that morning, the parking lot was already full. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering, avoiding eye contact. The local news van was parked at the curb, the big blue 7 News logo glaring in the sunlight. I felt every eye on me as I stepped out of my car. Then I saw her. Denise stood near the entrance, surrounded by her loyal board members like a queen with her guards. She looked immaculate, pressed blazer, pearls, not a hair out of place. But when our eyes met, I saw it, that flicker of something behind the mask. Fear, maybe, or the realization that her kingdom was starting to crumble. I walked right past her without saying a word. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. The hearing wasn't in a courtroom, but it felt like one. A long table up front for the county officials, rows of folding chairs for homeowners. Denise and her board sat on one side. I sat on the other. The lead investigator, a calm woman named Alvarez, opened the session. Today's agenda concerns multiple complaints regarding Willow Heights Homeowners Association, including financial discrepancies, misuse of authority, and procedural violations. Her tone was flat, but her eyes were sharp. Denise immediately leaned forward. Before we start, I'd like to state for the record that these accusations are baseless and defamatory. This entire process has been fueled by one disgruntled homeowner with a personal vendetta. She didn't even say my name, but the glance she threw me was razor sharp. I stood. Disgruntled? Denise, you fined me for the color of my mailbox, for parking in my own driveway, and for owning a car that doesn't fit your aesthetic. You've threatened to put a lien on my home for imaginary violations. And you've stolen from every single homeowner sitting here today. A murmur rippled through the room. I heard Mrs. Graham whisper to someone behind me. Alvarez raised a hand. Let's keep order. Mr. Parker, please proceed with your evidence. I opened my binder and took a deep breath. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering like a drum. The HOA bylaws require full transparency of financial records upon homeowner request. That request was denied multiple times, so I conducted a public record search. Here, I slid the first document forward. You'll see multiple payments made from the HOA account to Evergreen Property Services. This company doesn't exist in state filings. But the business registration for Evergreen was renewed last year under the name Daniel Whitaker. That's Denise's husband, gasps echoed. Denise's composure cracked for the first time, just a flicker, her hand tightening around her pen. I kept going. These payments total over $21,000, supposedly for landscaping and seasonal maintenance. Except no such services were ever performed. Multiple residents confirmed no contractors were ever seen. And when I checked the HOA's landscaping vendor on record, I held up another page. It wasn't Evergreen. It was a completely different company. The room went silent except for the rustle of paper. Alvarez looked at Denise. Would you like to respond to this? Denise smiled, but her voice trembled. These records must be forged. I've never authorized any payment to that name. I spoke again, calm but deliberate. That's interesting. Because these payment authorizations carry your signature. I flipped to the copies, her looping cursive, the same as the letters she'd sent me. There was no mistaking it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mrs. Graham, who'd once been her biggest ally, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Another board member, Jeff, cleared his throat and looked down at his lap. That's when Alvarez leaned forward. Mrs. Whitaker will be verifying these transactions with the bank directly. Until then, I'm placing a temporary suspension on your authority as HOA president. Denise's chair screeched as she stood up. This is absurd. You're taking the word of one bitter homeowner over years of dedicated service? He's twisting everything. Her voice broke mid-sentence. The mask was gone now, her calm, perfect veneer, cracking into something raw and ugly. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just watched because I knew what was coming. Alvarez turned to the rest of the room. We'll also be opening an investigation into the HOA's legal practices, including lien threats, unauthorized fines, and enforcement irregularities. Homeowners are welcome to submit documentation. Hands started going up all around me. One after another, neighbors spoke, quiet at first, then louder. Stories of fines for lawn colors, for children's toys on porches, for garden decorations not matching community standards. One man mentioned being threatened with foreclosure over a late payment that wasn't even his fault. Each voice added weight to the moment, until Denise couldn't hold her composure anymore. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You all agreed to the rules when you moved in. You wanted this community to be beautiful, safe, Perfect. You wanted me to take care of it. Her voice cracked again, desperation creeping through. And I did. I kept it clean. I kept it orderly. I made sure no one dragged us down. And this, she gestured at me, this troublemaker ruined everything. No one moved. Then Mrs. Graham stood up. Her voice shook, but it was clear. Denise, you threatened to fine me for putting up Christmas lights last year. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Denise's face flushed deep red. I was maintaining standards? She snapped. Another voice called out, You fined my son for riding his bike on the sidewalk. Then another. You told my husband his truck was an eyesore. It was like the floodgates broke open. Every whispered resentment, every petty humiliation she'd inflicted came pouring out. The room was a storm now, voices rising, overlapping, drowning her out. Denise slammed her hand on the table. Enough, she screamed. You people have no idea what it takes to run a community. You're ungrateful. She stopped, because Alvarez had stood up, calm, deliberate, commanding. Mrs. Whitaker, she said quietly, you need to leave this meeting. Denise's mouth fell open. You can't now. The hush that followed was absolute. You could hear the soft tap of her heels as she stormed out, slamming the door behind her, and just like that, it was over. At least that's what I thought. That night, the neighborhood was different. It was like the tension that had gripped every house for years finally cracked open. People were out talking, laughing softly, even apologizing. Mrs. Graham brought over cookies, eyes watery. You were right, she whispered. We should have spoken up sooner, but I didn't sleep easy. Not yet, because I knew Denise. She wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. And sure enough, 2 days later, it came, a letter. Again, but this one wasn't on HOA letterhead. It was from her lawyer. She was suing me for defamation, emotional distress, and harassment. It almost broke me. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, that same quiet filling the room again. I was tired. I'm so tired. The fight had gone on for months, and every victory felt like it came with a new cost. But then, something unexpected happened. The next morning, I opened my door to find a stack of envelopes on my porch. Handwritten letters. Neighbors, all of them, offering to testify on my behalf. One by one, they came forward, bringing their own documentation, their own proof. By the end of the week, Denise wasn't just facing a county inquiry, she was facing a class action lawsuit. The court hearing was brutal. Denise tried every trick, fake tears, claims of misunderstanding, blaming her board. But the evidence was overwhelming. The missing funds, the fake invoices, the intimidation, and then the moment that will stay with me forever. The judge looked over her glasses, voice calm but firm. Mrs. Whitaker, your conduct represents a gross abuse of power and a breach of fiduciary duty. This court orders your immediate removal from the Willow Heights HOA board, restitution of misappropriated funds, and a lifetime ban from serving on any homeowners association. Denise's face went pale. She looked around as if someone might save her, but no one did. Even her own husband avoided her eyes. And me? I finally exhaled for the first time in months. I felt the weight lift off my chest. Outside the courthouse, neighbors hugged me, shook my hand, thanked me. Some cried. The local news crew shoved a microphone in my face and asked, "What do you plan to do now?" I smiled. I'm going home, because that's all I ever wanted, to just live peacefully in the home I worked for. That night, I stood in my driveway, under the glow of the porch light, watching the rain begin to fall. It felt different now, cleansing, not heavy, the kind that washes away everything ugly, leaving just enough quiet to start over. I looked up at the dark windows across the street, Denise's old house. It sat empty now, for sale sign half tilted in the yard. Part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered every sleepless night, every threat, every ounce of fear she caused, and I realized something. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles and tells you it's keeping the neighborhood safe, and that's the thing about control. Once you strip it away from people like that, they can't survive without it. So I turned, walked inside, and shut the door behind me. For the first time in a long time, it actually felt like home. When the dust finally settled, Oakwood Ridge didn't look the same anymore. Not physically, but in spirit. The silence that followed the storm was almost deafening, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath after months of chaos, fear, and outrage. The once pristine lawns and identical mailboxes no longer represented order. They stood as silent witnesses to the unraveling of something that was never truly perfect to begin with. It started small, with whispers. The same neighbors who had once glared at each other from behind their curtains were now meeting at the end of driveways, talking in low tones about everything that had happened. Someone had leaked the HOA's internal emails, proof of corruption, manipulation, and personal vendettas. Screenshots spread through group chats, and printed copies were slipped under doors. For the first time, the residents began to see what had really been happening behind those closed boardroom doors. Janet, the HOA president who once strutted around with her clipboard like a sheriff in her own little kingdom, was at the center of it all. Her emails revealed she'd been using HOA funds for personal expenses, landscaping her backyard, paying for a private security service, even hiring her nephew's failing construction company for repairs. When the news hit, the outrage was immediate and unstoppable. Neighbors who had once been terrified to speak up were now furious that they hadn't done so sooner. Harold from across the street, who'd been fined 3 times for having an American flag too large for the HOA standards, was one of the first to call a special community meeting. Others followed. By the time the gathering took place, over 100 people showed up, spilling onto the sidewalk and front lawns. The homeowner at the center of it all, our protagonist, who had endured months of harassment, humiliation, and escalating threats, stood near the back, watching. They weren't the loudest voice in the crowd anymore, nor did they need to be. The truth spoke for itself now. The community had finally turned its rage toward the real enemy. The meeting grew heated. Voices cracked with anger as residents read out the evidence. Fraudulent invoices, selective enforcement of rules, even threats made to silence dissenting board members. Janet tried to defend herself, claiming it was all taken out of context, but her words were drowned out by shouts. For years she'd controlled the neighborhood through fear and fines, but now that power was slipping through her fingers. When the vote of no confidence was called, every hand went up except hers and her 2 closest allies. Even they hesitated, realizing how deeply they'd tied themselves to her downfall. By the end of the night, Janet was officially removed from the board, and the HOA's management company announced it would be terminating its contract, pending a full audit. It wasn't just a victory, it was liberation, but justice has a way of echoing long after the verdict is reached. A few weeks later, an investigative journalist from the local news picked up the story. The scandal spread far beyond Oakwood Ridge. HOA corruption wasn't new, but this was egregious. There were interviews, hidden camera footage, and even drone shots of the neighborhood that had once prided itself on being picture perfect. The story trended for days. Soon after, law enforcement got involved. Subpoenas were issued, and Janet's world crumbled piece by piece. Her husband left town quietly. Her home went up for sale, and in a twist that almost seemed poetic, her own property was cited for multiple violations, the very same infractions she'd once fined others for. Meanwhile, the protagonist's life began to heal. For the first time in months, they could sit on their porch without dread tightening their chest. The sun felt warmer, the air lighter. The neighbors who had once looked away now waved, stopped to talk, or brought over home-baked pies as apologies for their silence. It wasn't just about peace. It was about reclaiming dignity. They began repairing the garden that had once sparked so much controversy. The roses returned, blooming brighter than before, as if nature itself had been waiting for this moment of release. They painted the fence, replaced the broken mailbox, and hung a small sign near the door that read, "Home is peace, not power." In time, the HOA was restructured completely. A new board was elected, made up of residents who genuinely cared about community rather than control. Meetings were open, transparent, and for the first time, respectful. There were disagreements, of course, but they were handled like adults. Democracy had finally come to Oakwood Ridge, but even in victory, the scars remained. The protagonist couldn't walk past the old community hall without remembering the shouting matches, the humiliation, the endless letters and fines that had nearly broken them. Sometimes, late at night, they'd catch themselves glancing out the window, half expecting another warning notice on their door. Trauma lingers, even when justice is served. One evening, months after the chaos had ended, they received a handwritten letter. It was from one of Janet's former allies on the board, the treasurer, who had quietly resigned before everything exploded. The letter was short, almost painfully so. It read, "You were right about everything. I knew it, but I was too afraid to say it. I'm sorry. I hope you can finally breathe again." They sat there, reading it over and over, until tears blurred the words. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something close to closure. Life in Oakwood Ridge began to transform in small, almost invisible ways. Kids played in the cul-de-sacs again. The neighborhood watch became less about spying and more about helping. People stopped filing petty complaints and started helping each other fix the problems instead. The fences still stood tall, but the walls between people began to fall. The protagonist's story spread far beyond their street. Online forums picked it up. YouTube commentators discussed the case. Lawyers used it as a cautionary tale in seminars about HOA overreach. What had started as one person's nightmare had turned into a national conversation about accountability and abuse of power in communities everywhere. And maybe that was the most powerful victory of all. Not just surviving the storm, but inspiring others to stand up for themselves. Still, there were moments of haunting reflection. Sometimes they'd wonder, how had it gotten that bad? How had so many people turned a blind eye for so long? Was it fear? Complacency? Or just the illusion that peace meant silence? One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the soft glow of porch lights began to flicker on, the protagonist stood outside, listening to the sound of laughter drifting from a nearby barbecue. The air smelled like charcoal and lilacs. For the first time in what felt like forever, they smiled without hesitation. Peace had returned, but it wasn't the kind of peace that came from obedience or control. It was the peace that comes from truth, finally breaking through the lies. Months later, they were invited to speak at a local community forum about HOA reform. Standing in front of a crowd of homeowners, they told their story, not with bitterness, but with hard-earned clarity. They talked about fear, power, and the price of silence. When they finished, the room erupted in applause. As they stepped down from the podium, someone approached them, a young couple who'd recently moved into a nearby development. They looked nervous, but determined. The woman said softly, "We're dealing with something similar." Your story, it gave us courage. That moment meant more than any fine overturned or headline written. Because sometimes justice isn't about punishing the guilty, it's about empowering the afraid. And that's exactly what they'd done. Oakwood Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was honest now. The fear that once choked the air had been replaced with a quiet understanding. No one person, no board, no bylaw should ever hold that much power over people's lives again.